Here is a little bit of the large intestine, and then finally just talking a little bit about how we break down some of these different nutrients and absorb them. So, the last thing I kind of talked about here is a little bit about the peritoneum in general, as well as the large intestine. So, peritoneum of our serous membranes, we talked about the pleural, we talked about the pericardium, we talked about a number of different things like that. Peritoneum is the largest one. Lots of different parts of this visceral peritoneum have a number of folds that are going to cover all these organs. There is actually some space behind this one, unlike some of the other ones that we talked about, this retroperitoneal space, and then the space within it, the peritoneal cavity, and ascites is that buildup of fluid in that cavity. So when you look at it here, you can see a lot of the intestines are filled within this little pouch around there, and then you can see that omentum, that material, that mesentery is helping to hold all that together, and then you have little wrappings of that are covering a lot of these intestines as for the visceral peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum, you saw this when we opened up the cat. It is that part that is covering the whole opening there. And in the cat, it looked a little bit different than this, a little not quite as fat like this, a little bit more little blobs of fat, and almost looks like a spider web. That is that greater omentum. That is the outer part of the peritoneum that when you open up the abdominal cavity, it's the first thing you're going to see. So that's a little bit of the connective tissues in there. Outside of that, we need to talk a little bit about the large intestine. Gets its name because it's larger in diameter, definitely shorter. It's only about 8 foot long, but wider. Doing mainly absorption and mainly water absorption. So this thing is, I mean, I would still say most of the water is absorbed in the small intestines, but this is finishing up the process. There is certain digestion that takes place here in terms of materials, but it's bacterial digestion, and we are a lot of times absorbing some of that. And really, the main thing the large intestine do is packaging the feces for expulsion. And then again, this says a lot of the same stuff. You're absorbing water and electrolytes out of here. Everything else is compacted into feces, and everybody knows feces. So this is from the ileocecal junction to the anus. In terms of the parts of it, it's pretty straightforward. You kind of have a dead-end pouch that has a little finger-like structure going off of it. That is the cecum. And the finger-like projection is the appendix. It has a lot of lymphatic nodules within it. Can help repopulate the colon with bacteria sometimes after something clears it out. Again, appendix is another thing here that is a little bit non-necessary. You can have it removed and live fine. Again, they try to avoid that if possible. And that is that lower right quadrant. So a lot of times lower right quadrant pain, a lot of times is appendicitis. But the cecum is kind of this blind pouch that is connected to the ileum, has a sphincter separating it. We then have the different parts of the colon. So the colon, we're going to see it's going to kind of work up one side. So you have the ascending colon, that is this upside down U. Ascending is where it's traveling up. You have the transverse that heads across the body. You then have the descending that goes on the other side, and the terms are called colic flexures and make a big 90-degree. So transverse goes across, you hit the left colic flexure, which is going to turn it down. It's going to head down that descending colon. We then get this S curve, that is that sigmoid colon. And again, it's going to drop into the pelvic cavity within the peritoneum. And this terminates at the rectum, which is the last part of the large intestine. It is retroperitoneal, is going to connect to the anus. It has a number of tubes and folds within it that allow it to be able to expand and hold these feces. To me, kind of the unloading dock, if you want to think about it that way. The anal canal is the last few centimeters here. It goes from being simple columnar, again, still throughout all of the large intestine. When you get to the anal canal, you see this dividing line, and there's right on a particular line, it will go from being columnar to stratified squamous. So really kind of one of those very surprising histology type of things. And then you have these little columns that are part of the anus here. You have two sphincters. One is an involuntary muscle in the inner part of the anus. That is one you don't have control over. Does have a resting tension to it, which is a good thing. You then have the external sphincter, which is one you have voluntary control over, normally closed, but you relax it in order to do number 2. This shows the anus, and you can see the external sphincter and the internal sphincter right here. And this shows you the different parts of that colon. So you can see the cecum is this dead end pouch here with the appendix. You have the ascending, transverse, descending, and then you have the sigmoid colon with the S curve getting down to the rectum and the anal canal. If you ever have to have this image, a lot of times they'll give you what's called a barium enema, which gives you something up you know where that can actually let you visualize the colon under an x-ray or a scan of some sort. Like I said, the histology of this, it is a lot of simple columnar epithelial cells. Numerous goblet cells. More and more as we get further down here. It's probably, in some cases, almost half of the cells are goblet cells. And again, the whole idea here is to do a lot of mucus to make sure, especially as we're taking more and more water out of these materials, that none of that crap is getting stuck, literally. It does have a muscularis, does not have those circular folds at all. You have what are called these tenia coli, which are these little pouches, as you can see right here. The structure right here, and you have these little hostra, these pouches. And again, if you're looking at it like this, it's going to have these little vascular pits. It's not vascular, but these little intestinal pits here, intestinal glands, much like the small intestine we saw. Again, lots of goblet cells. Probably about half of these are goblet cells. And you can kind of see, looking at it here, again, seeing most of that mucosa, the lumen. Again, no microvilli, no microvilli. Really, most of the action that's taking place in here is actually from your microbes, your indigenous microbiota, or normal flora, if you want to call it that. These are breaking down some of the stuff that's remaining in here. Can produce carbon dioxide and other gases that can lead to flatus. Can definitely also provide some vitamins to us that are absorbed from the large intestine. Again, all the blood here from still is going to go through that hepatic portal system before it enters back into the main bloodstream. The movements here not nearly as strong as the small intestine. You will get some churning within the hostra, this little kind of contraction, relaxation, moving stuff down there. Most of the movements are what we call mass movements. These contractions involved in that tenia coli that basically after you eat a meal, a lot of times is going to move materials down to the rectum in order to have a bowel movement at some point. And again, a lot of times eating something will help move this stuff down. So that's part of the reason, especially a lot of times after you eat something, you tend to have to go to the bathroom. As the rectum fills, that is going to send messages up to the spinal cord telling you that, hey, you need to run to the bathroom here. More and more parasympathetic output, which is going to actually start telling that internal sphincter to kind of relax a little bit. By about age 3, you learn how to do this bowel movement on your own, 3 or 4. It's called the Valsalva maneuver, which is actually a lot of times holding your breath a little bit and then that kind of bearing down type of thing. So when this kind of talks about the idea right here, what's happening with this, again, you can read through it, but it's basically what we just said. So really the last show that we need to talk about on this one is really the enzymes and how we absorb some of